Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. Now we turn to the situation in Cameroon. For a little bit of context, in October of 2019, Nebane Abienwi, a 37-year-old Cameroonian man, died in ICE custody in San Diego. Abienwi was one of at least 10,000 Cameroonians seeking asylum in the United States. So I'd like to talk about the situation in Cameroon, its kind of colonial history, and sort of the different struggles against settler colonialism there, or sort of in this case, neocolonialism rather. To talk about all of this and more, we are joined by Joe Tache, who is an editor and writer with Liberation News. Thank you very much, Joe, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's actually start with kind of the situation in Cameroon today that's leading to people kind of coming from Cameroon trying to seek refuge in the United States and other countries. What generally does Cameroon look like for those who might not be familiar with the political situation?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a West African nation, and there has been a lot going on the past few years, a lot that has been driving people to migrate both within and outside of the country. But I've been focusing mainly on something that's been kind of dubbed the Anglophone crisis. So Cameroon has multiple regions, but is largely divided by the legacy of colonialism. So there's kind of the northern western regions of Cameroon that are predominantly English speaking, termed the Anglophone regions. And then the rest of the country, the majority is Francophone or French speaking, as colonized by France. And in 2016, there were some large movements led by lawyers and teachers in the Anglophone regions protesting mainly the use of French and Francophone structures in schools and courts, and kind of a lack of autonomy in the educational and judicial systems in the Western regions. And they kind of blew up. There is a lot of popular energy that went into these protests, a general feeling of marginalization in those English-speaking regions. And the protests have been going on ever since, really. And they've been really heavily cracked down upon by the Cameroonian government. A few thousand people have died, and many people have been displaced. Many people have migrated to Nigeria, which Cameroon shares a border with, but also many have tried to make the journey across the Atlantic and seek refuge in the United States. And they've been coming up through Central America, through Mexico. As many as 10,000 Cameroonians are detained at the U.S.-Mexico border. And that's kind of what fueled the context for us seeing more, particularly Cameroonian asylum seekers coming to the United States and being detained here.
Yeah, you wrote an article for Liberation News titled "Neocolonialism Spurs Ongoing Crisis in Cameroon," which is sort of the basis for our interview today in many ways. So one of the points you made that much of the Western media coverage has given a lot of credence to the idea of Cameroon's, I think you said, quote unquote, Anglo-Saxon heritage in the Western regions of Cameroon. Can you maybe talk about why that's become such a, why the media has focused specifically on that kind of aspect of it, maybe?
Sure. I think part of it is just the reality is that a lot of the discontent has kind of circled around this idea of, are you French speaking or are you English speaking, and what region do you live in? And there's actually been also emerged a pretty large separatist movement in those English speaking regions that they're fighting for what they call the Republic of Ambazonia, so an independent Anglophone state. But the thing that kind of really sticks out to me, and something that I've just been studying a lot because my father is from Cameroon and kind of from a region that kind of straddles both the English-speaking and French-speaking regions, and so he's bilingual. I'm doing a lot of research, and in reality, the history of English and French colonialism in Cameroon is relatively short. And they're both only periods of about 40 years, because Cameroon developing for centuries pre-colonialism, but it was taken as the property of Germany, actually, during the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. So this is when the imperialist powers of Europe, where kind of development had matured or stalled and then started to monopolize, and their domestic markets started to kind of send their tentacles outward more aggressively. And in order to kind of mitigate the tensions of all these different imperialist powers competing for colonial lands, they held this conference to literally carve up Africa arbitrarily, right? And so Cameroon initially became property of Germany, but Germany during the imperialist First World War of the early 20th century, Germany lost its colonial holdings, and Cameroon was kind of taken into the stewardship, right, of France and of Great Britain, and it was again arbitrarily carved. So for the first time the second time, sorry, in just a few decades, Cameroon was carved up again, kind of not due to any natural boundaries or due to the kind of internal development, but because of the whims of the European imperialist powers. And so that division of Francophone, Anglophone, or French and English colonialism only existed for about 40 years before Cameroon gained its independence, both regions, and they voted to reunify. And I can go a little bit into kind of my analysis or my thinking about kind of how this the ideas of tribalism or the ideas of being split up based on who you were colonized by is almost or is in many ways a misdirection of kind of legitimate grievances that people have.
And what sort of what legitimate grievances kind of are there? I'd definitely like to get into sort of that immediate period of kind of the post-colonial or sort of the neocolonial era, however you'd like to kind of phrase that. But yeah, what sort of are the kind of legitimate grievances here? What are sort of the real societal divides within Cameroonian society beyond the sort of surface level, the very cosmetic divide of Anglophone versus Francophone?
Sure. Well, Cameroon, like the entire continent, has been underdeveloped through the legacies of colonialism, and there is definitely immense poverty in Cameroon, a lot of inequality, and a lot of corruption in the government. A lot of people kind of filling their own pockets with the wealth of the country, and I think that there's also been a lot of kind of legacy of austerity or kind of neoliberalism of Cameroon being forced to take out loans from the International Monetary Fund, kind of privatizing certain industries that were not necessarily state controlled, but they had kind of quasi-governmental companies that could nationalize, partially nationalize some of Cameroon's natural resources, like oil, big natural resource in Cameroon. And just in general, the opening of markets to the West and the prevention of a strong internal development of industry in Cameroon. So there is definitely a lot to be mad about. But, as many states do across the world, depending on whatever division is most pertinent in that area, the struggles have been kind of diverted into people seeing their issues as, oh, I was colonized by the English, I have this English heritage, and I'm being marginalized on that basis because the president of Cameroon is French speaking and has been French speaking since Cameroon was gained independence, and the French speaking presidents have kind of maintained an allegiance to their former colonial puppet masters, right, where they've allowed the French to own major industries and resources in Cameroon, and they've considered the French to be their closest allies, which really just means that they are subservient to the interests of the French, right? And the current president of Cameroon, Paul Biya, is known for spending almost more time in Europe than he spends in his actual country, and kind of taking the counsel of the French and the rest of the Western powers into great consideration. And so people see that this corruption is happening. They see that the great wealth of this country is being stripped and diverted away. But instead of looking at a government that has a neocolonial relationship with their former colonial powers and seeing the problem of this continued exploitation of Cameroon by the West, they see it as just Francophone versus Anglophone. And their leaders are kind of pushing them in the direction of seeing that to divert this popular energy that is combating these these feelings of or combating the systems of neocolonialism, combating the systems of austerity. They're pushing that popular energy that could actually unite people, because there are, of course, many people living in poverty who are technically quote unquote francophone Cameroonians, right? But because they have been divided on these lines of francophone and anglophone, that national unity or that class-based unity that could really create a very powerful movement is being diverted away into separatist movements or into federalist movements or any variety of types of things.
Yeah, and it's really just part and parcel of the Western divide and conquer tactic that allowed for kind of the European imperialism, project to develop in the first place. The kind of neo-colonial setup that many countries have, and that sort of a dependent relationship on these different European powers that you're talking about, was developed very much on purpose. Sort of the European powers in many ways saw the writing on the walls post World War II, and then sort of through the 50s and the early 60s. They saw that essentially colonialism in that particular model was no longer viable with sort of the existence of the Soviet Union, with the liberation of China, the establishment of these major socialist states. And so they decided essentially in many ways to kind of steer things as favorably to themselves as they possibly could, to have sort of a soft landing for colonialism. So I'd say generally there have been kind of three different formulations for, there have been three different kind of economic and social models for post-colonial states. There's been kind of the socialist model, which is to say sort of a nationalization of the resources, as well as a sort of radical democratic experiment at the heart of that essentially puts sort of collectives of workers at the heart of kind of controlling industry. There's kind of a bourgeois nationalist model or a state capitalist model, where essentially there's still the nationalization element of the economy, but then there's also on top of that, it's more based in a sort of capitalist mode of exploiting the workers. So there's still an exploiter class and an exploited class within kind of a bourgeois capitalist model, but generally sort of the development of sort of the infrastructure, roads, schools, electricity, whatnot, is also developed along sort of what's best for sort of the bourgeoisie of the country in order for the country itself to sort of become a regional power or whatnot. And then there's this kind of neo-colonial model that is kind of the comprador bourgeoisie model, where essentially the development of economic and social relations is entirely based on sort of the continued export of cheap land, cheap minerals and cheap labor, essentially to benefit sort of the imperial cores. And that is definitely what happened not only to much of Africa and the Middle East, but more specifically to Cameroon, which we're talking about at the moment. The French, sort of seeing the writing on the wall with regard to their colonies, decided essentially to establish this system where essentially the leadership, the sort of old colonial sort of comprador bourgeoisie, kind of stayed in power. And they also set up something that was highly sectarian, kind of on their way out the door, which was this idea that the president should always be francophone and that the vice president should always be Anglophone, which leads to essentially people turning against each other when they should, when for various reasons they should see the French to continue to be the exploitative power here.
Just also to kind of touch on some of the points that you raised, Cameroon had a very early and strong organized armed deliberation movement. It was led by this party and movement called the UPC, the Union of the Populations of Cameroon. And some of their main principles are national reunification, but also taking the resources of Cameroon and using them to benefit the people, redistributing land and redistributing or rethinking the models of ownership of resources so that the resources and the profits and the capital from the development of industry in Cameroon would not just go and fill the coffers of France and England and the rest of the imperialist powers, but actually help develop country internally. And so, like you said, this movement was subverted, and as France saw that this movement had the power to actually win genuine independence for Cameroon, they granted independence and appointed this new president, Amadou Ahidjo, who they knew was a much safer bet to serve the interests of the French. And of course, independence is not something that would just be granted nicely by imperialists or colonial powers, right? It has to be fought for and won, and that was a process that was subverted and undermined in Cameroon. And so that structure of this president being francophone and the vice president being anglophone or English speaking occurred about a year after both regions were granted independence by their respective the colonial powers. But again, it was a way of entrenching this colonial paradigm of politics on top of the country, right? Because prior to colonialism, that was not how people were developing their identities. That's not how people were developing a sense of national identity. They had a completely different way that they were developing. And just in these 40 years, colonialism was able to completely skew what politics should look like. And so people, again, are defining their political representation based on which colonial language they speak versus on if their needs are really being met. And if these elites that are English speaking, that are subservient to the colonial powers to those colonial powers that have formerly and to some extent still rule Cameroon, they're not actually looking at them on the class interests that they serve, but on this constructed colonial identity that they belong to.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. If you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We are speaking with Joe Tache, who is editor and writer for Liberation News about the political situation in Cameroon. And just to sort of recap what we mentioned at the top of the hour, essentially, we're talking about this because at least 10,000 Cameroonians have been seeking asylum in the United States. A Cameroonian man died in ICE custody in October of 2019. And so we're basically just going over the situation, especially to show, I think, how colonialism creates these kind of false divides, creates these sectarian systems where before there was not that particular form of sectarianism as a sort of divide and conquer. It's very interesting that this has been a very large part of the protests, for instance, in Lebanon that happened this past year, that happened in late 2019. In the Lebanese protests, the essentially economic situation had become so dire, and the ability of the Lebanese government to provide even basic social services to most of its citizens, such as trash pickup, had become so dire that essentially it was finally able to cut across these rigidly defined sectarian lines that were defined largely, again, in the same way by sort of the departing colonial overlords to set up this system where like certain parts of the government were kind of officially or unofficially designated as part of a Sunni or Shia, different sects and whatnot. Iraq actually had a similar system post U.S. invasion, where the U.S. essentially set up three different branches of the government to belong kind of officially to Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia populations, and so the idea, at least on paper, with that sort of thing, is to quote unquote prevent sectarianism, or to provide a system of government where everybody has representation. At least that's what the U.S. says. Of course, we know very well the U.S. doesn't actually care about that. We know that the U.S. did that in particular in Iraq to essentially exacerbate these sectarian divides in ways that people weren't really thinking of them before. So it kind of calls into existence this form of divide that then gets used to sort of rule the country. Despite that, though, there continues to be a movement going back to Cameroon that is seeking to sort of bridge this divide, is seeking to sort of truly win a sort of anti-colonial independence for Cameroon, not only the official anti-colonial, like being an independent state, but truly being independent of these forces such as these predatory IMF loans as well. Can you maybe talk about how that's taking shape?
Sure. There are definitely a wide variety of political actors in Cameroon right now. I wouldn't say that one has necessarily risen to a dominant position. I think there's a lot of struggle to be seen about, which movements, which political formations will be able to kind of draw a critical mass of people. to support that program and to struggle for it. Yeah, they're like I mentioned the UPC earlier, and they were really brutally crushed this militant armed national liberation struggle, and were really crushed kind of hand in hand with the French military and intelligence services and the kind of neocolonial Ahijo government that was appointed by the French when they granted this nominal independence. And the UPC is definitely not what it once was and has gone through a number of splits, but that's a force that still exists and still is calling for national unification and a genuine independence from neocolonialism. They're part of a larger movement called Stand for Cameroon, which has a variety of different political forces, but all of them are calling for a political transition, so a transition away from this Paul Biya's government. He's been president for about over 30 years now, so a transition from his government and kind of a retooling. I don't know if there's necessarily a unified position on what this would look like, but either a retooling or rewriting of the Constitution of Cameroon. And there's also kind of more moderate kind of legal political parties that have space in the parliament that are definitely not as militant, but are calling for some kind of, more some social democratic views. So there's a lot of different political forces on top of these more separatist or federalist movements in Cameroon. So it still remains to be seen kind of what the future holds politically in terms of which of these groups will really be able to consolidate some kind of power.
So capitalism having reshaped so much of the world, essentially the entire world, in its own image in various ways, having had such a devastating impact, certainly at times I think seems absolutely insurmountable. We see these kind of situations where there's these kind of sectarian divides and whatnot. But I think one of the things you point out in the article is just the thousands of years of kind of rich history of Cameroon, and how that so kind of thoroughly predates what was basically a very, very short colonial period, as we were talking about. It was essentially half a century of actual colonialism that's done this damage. So kind of living as we are in sort of the century of post-colonialism, the century where colonialism continues to be sort of an issue that faces the world, but a century after which essentially like the liberation began. I think we tend to see these things as a little more insurmountable than they are, but in fact it does seem, again, not to minimize the vast struggles ahead of us, and not to say that capitalism is just going to sort of decay and die out on its own, not to say that these imperialist forces are necessarily just going to dissolve, but nonetheless, it seems if you look to me at the broader trajectory of history, it does seem that there is a bit of a return to sort of traditional cultures that were not subsumed under these kind of capitalist identities, but that is still kind of responsive to this kind of political moment. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's power in knowing that this reality that we're living is not a historical inevitability, right? And like you're saying, it has been a relatively brief moment or period in history, and many Marxist and Pan-Africanist writers have kind of discussed the period of colonialism as the removal of Africa as a continent, but all the individual or regional or local development that was happening in Africa, the removal of the development of our peoples from our own history, right? And kind of removing Africans as a subject of history, who have a role in developing their own societies, to objects of someone else's history, right? To objects of colonialism and imperialism. And there's great writings by people like Walter Rodney and Emile Cabral that kind of talk about this concept. And I think the reality is that does not have to be permanent. And I think that these struggles across the continent, although there's a lot of ideological and political work to do, show that people are always resisting this arrangement of the world, right? And that wherever there's exploitation and oppression, there are people resisting and moving and rising up. And so I think the popular energy in Cameroon, I think the legacy of the UPC, and even just the power of some of these movements, the protesters in Cameroon have used a tactic called ghost towns, which is very similar to like a general strike that we might see, but maybe a little bit less of a role of organized labor in those movements. But the power and militancy of these movements, and although I might not be completely ideologically aligned with them, I think just understanding that people are really heroically fighting, it definitely gives me hope. Just seeing 2019 as a year of protest and radical protests against neoliberalism, against imperialism. I mean, it's really exciting to see.
I just kind of did a series on different protests against neoliberalism. So we went everywhere from we talked to people everywhere from like Haiti, Lebanon. We talked about the situations in Colombia, in Chile, and Iraq. Like they're truly, 2019 was a year of global protests all across the world. And in each place, there were so many kind of similarities, but there were also just these kind of slight differences. These essentially, I don't want to say local flavors because they certainly are tied up in rich sort of local politics for sure. But there are these different kind of local ways in which these struggles play out. Can you talk about what this ghost town phenomenon really is?
Yeah, so it actually has roots in the 1990s because before this more recent outbreak in 2016, there was a lot of unrest in the early 90s, particularly in 1991. And, some historical records show that, in 1991, there are up to 2 million people in Cameroon that were participating in this ghost town tactic. And then it was this time, it was shortly after the adoption of these IMF structural adjustment programs that go along with loans that countries take out from the IMF. And so there was, again, this uprising against austerity. And there was both unrest on college campuses in Cameroon and in both Francophone and Anglophone villages that were, again, protesting the conditions of living. And so during those protests in the 90s, while there was some character of, these concepts of Anglophone and Francophone, there wasn't the same, very strong armed secessionist movement or independence movement like there is in 2016. But there is definitely this show of force against the forces of austerity and forces of just economic exploitation. And I think really showing, people know that one of the strongest tools that they have as working people is to withhold their labor and, also to another extent to withhold their purchasing power. So this is a way of kind of just shutting down a town, right? Not participating in work, people not going to school, not going to markets. It's really, it's a self-descriptive phrase almost, making the town a ghost town. Usually pictures of these protests or these demonstrations, the streets are just empty, right? That people are not participating in the economy. And I think, again, it shows that there is this power to tap into of withholding labor, of seeing the power that people have in their particular class position to make an impact. And I think that it's really people using the tools that they have to stand up. I think it's been definitely a powerful tactic, both in the 1990s for people in Cameroon and most recently in the past 3 years.
Yeah, we have about a minute left. Are there any other kind of aspects, either of the struggles in Cameroon or Cameroonian history, that we didn't get to hit on that you think are particularly kind of interesting or that people need to know?
I mean, I think just one thing I want to mention is that, sometimes when you see that people are very entrenched in these ideas of Francophone or Anglophone or any type of tribalism elsewhere, it feels like it can be insurmountable, that this is the way that people have to see politics or have to see their ways of life. And I think that, again, just the tradition of the UPC and a national liberation struggle that was so powerful kind of shows that this is not necessarily how people have to identify with politics. And even, in previous electoral campaigns, there have been campaigns that have talked to the needs of both working class Anglophones and working class Francophones, right? Because everybody needs those basic things: housing, healthcare, food. And that's things that can really unite a population of people who are oppressed and exploited. And so I think going forward, there is always hope for an identity of struggle based on class solidarity, and kind of ditching the labels, the identities that have been imposed by the colonial masters.
We are going to go ahead and wrap up there. We were joined by Joe Tache, who is an editor and writer with Liberation News, to talk about the situation in Cameroon. Thank you very much, Joe, for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Brianna.
So Martin Luther King Day is coming up this week. So what I would like to do in celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. King is air an older interview. This is actually one of the very first interviews I did early in 2018 with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor of history at the University of Houston, as well as the author of many books, including The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism and The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Some of the material within this is kind of time specific to 2018, but generally, I think some of it is also a good reminder of kind of how these political battles are cyclical in some ways. So we talk about, for instance, Trump's remarks on Haiti around that point. And it's also generally kind of relevant to keep that sort of perspective and not let some of the very time-sensitive stuff take away from sort of the larger discussion of kind of world politics, the Trump administration as it stands, and, you know, generally like the state of kind of Black liberation within the United States. So this is a very, I believe, informative interview about Dr. Martin Luther King and his situation, his how he was situated within the Black radical tradition with Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, first of all, since you mentioned Cornel West, I should also reference his book published, I think, in the last year or so called The Radical King, which provides further perspective in what we're going to be discussing right now. You may know that it was in the early 1960s that then U.S. President John F. Kennedy invited Martin Luther King into the Rose Garden of the White House in order to escape what might be thought to be the microphones of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by J. Edgar Hoover. And what President Kennedy wanted to mention to Dr. King was that President Kennedy, wanted Dr. King to rid himself of one of his top advisors. I'm speaking of Jack Odell, who was reputed to be a communist in a land where anti-communism was the reigning gospel. Martin Luther King, in a certain sense, agreed to rid himself of Jack, but that really never happened. He kept a subterranean relationship with him, which of course infuriated the FBI, which was monitoring his phone calls, his correspondence, his hotel rooms, and everything else, and knew this relationship was going on, which was one of the reasons why J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, called Dr. King a notorious liar. And Jack Odell, it's unclear, I should say, whether or not he was a member of the Communist Party, although he probably was. Jack had been a leader of the National Maritime Union, which was initiated by communists in the 1930s as a union of maritime workers, that is to say, seafarers. You may be familiar with my book, Red Seas, which deals with one of the founders of the National Maritime Union, Ferdinand Smith, who was of Jamaican origin and was a member of the Communist Party. Jack spoke very highly of Ferdinand Smith, and Ferdinand Smith was ousted unceremoniously from the leadership of the Union as the Red Scare was launched and then was deported back to his native Jamaica. But it's not only Jack Odell who helped to influence Dr. King in a left-wing direction that was ratified when Dr. King was killed in April 1968 when protesting alongside sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, protesting for higher wages and better working conditions. And that was part of this pro-union orientation of Dr. King. And in a conservative country like this, and I would particularly say a conservative state like Texas, unions oftentimes seem to have the effect of being considered a four-letter word, that is to say, considered as an emblem of radicalism. I'm also happy to say that Dr. King's favorite union was the Hospital Workers Union in New York City, a union that myself, a self-proclaimed radical, used to work for as a lawyer. But you should also know that a few months before Dr. King was assassinated in April 1968, he gave a prophetic speech on behalf of Freedom Ways magazine, which was a left-leaning magazine targeting the Black community, and Jack Odell was one of the editors of Freedom Ways. And in this fundraising affair for Freedom Ways magazine, Dr. King saluted W.E.B. Du Bois and rejected anti-communism, which, as noted, was the reigning gospel of the United States of America, but which he saw correctly as fueling the criminal genocidal war in Vietnam and in Indochina generally, not to mention the then partnership between Washington and racist Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Washington and apartheid South Africa. You may also know about the speech that Dr. King gave in April 1967, perhaps a year to the day before he was killed on April 4th, 1968. This speech was given at Riverside Church in Upper Manhattan, a stone's throw from Harlem, where he denounced and renounced the war in Vietnam, even though that not only jeopardized his relationship with President Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, but also jeopardized whatever ties he had remaining with the U.S. ruling elite. He was castigated, that is to say, Dr. King, and the editorial pages of most of the leading newspapers, and was viciously attacked to the point when just before he was killed, even though there is a national holiday marked for Dr. King, the United States of America, he was not necessarily popular, at least amongst the Euro-American majority. He retained his popularity amongst the black majority, needless to say, which saw him as sacrificing on their behalf because he was an abstemious figure. He had an old sedan that he drove. The thousands that he got for winning the Nobel Peace Prize was donated to his organization. So I think it's fair to say that there is a side of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that is oftentimes ignored, as there are those who think that this holiday should be for getting bargains at department stores that are giving discounts in his name.
You mentioned that he was bringing up Du Bois. Can you maybe situate him within a larger pattern of Black radical thought from the 20th century, or even before that or onward?
Well, first of all, I should have mentioned when I mentioned the February 1968 speech on behalf of Freedom Ways magazine that he saluted W.E.B. Du Bois, born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, passing away in 1963 in Ghana, West Africa, a founder in the NAACP, a man who was ousted from the NAACP in 1948, not least because that association was forced to toe the Red Scare and anti-communist line. W.B. Du Bois joined the Communist Party in 1961 as he was decamping to permanent exile in Ghana, where he died in 1963 on the eve of the March on Washington, where he was saluted even by moderate leaders. Speaking of Dr. King and the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King, speaking of W.B. Du Bois, and who was saluted by moderate leaders, and of course Martin Luther King himself was catapulted into prominence as a result of his I Have a Dream speech at that March on Washington. King and Du Bois are part of a longer Black radical tradition. You may know that I've written a book casting doubt upon the creation myth of the United States of America. The Counter-Revolution of 1776 is the title of the book, and in it I argue that the United States was founded not least because London, the colonial power, was moving towards abolition of slavery, as represented in the Somerset's case in June 1772 in England, and secondly, because of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where London sought to restrain the settlers led by George Washington, slaveholder number one, from moving westward, seizing the Native Americans' land and causing London to spend blood and treasure fighting Native Americans. As a direct result, you found disproportionately, overwhelmingly, the Black population did not side with George Washington, which should not be surprising. The Black population also did not side with the settlers in what was then called Rhodesia, when they thought they were walking the footsteps of 1776, when in November 1965, they executed a secession from the British Empire, like George Washington did, and their secession was defeated, unlike the one in 1776. But I think to understand the pulverizing and penalizing and punishment inflicted on Black people since the founding of the United States, you have to understand that when you fight a war and lose, which is what the blacks did, you should expect to be punished and penalized and pulverized forevermore until you can turn the tables, which basically involves organizing internationally, lengthening the battlefield. And that's the essence of the black radical tradition, as evidenced by the rise of the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, the chief abolitionist of the slavery era, who spent more time in London, the then antagonist of the United States of America, than, say, Paul Robeson, the comrade of W.E.B. Du Bois, spent in Moscow. Paul Robeson, as you know, was a singer, actor, political activist, probably the most famous black person of his era, before he too ran afoul of the Red Scare in the 1950s, leading to the sidelining of his career. I should also mention that part of the black radical tradition as well is developing an analysis. And when you develop an analysis, you'll come to the conclusion that Dr. King, despite his brilliance and his unique qualities, that he was also a product of the moment. It's not only the man, it was the moment. The moment being, in the 1950s, you had Africa and Caribbean nations surging towards independence, and the United States felt that it was handicapped in winning hearts and minds on that continent and in that region, the Caribbean, as long as the black people here were subjected to such a hellish, atrocious Jim Crow, apartheid oppression. And so that created favorable conditions for the retreat of the more egregious and horrible aspects of Jim Crow and the emergence of one Martin Luther King Jr. Perhaps if he had emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, like so many black protesters then, he would have found himself on the wrong end or the business end of a lyncher's rope. So this is part of the black radical tradition. That is to say, doing an analysis that not only takes into account individual heroism, but also takes into account the objective conditions that individual heroism has to confront and at times overcome.
Black people, especially black soldiers, fighting for the British against the American Revolution or whatnot, or fighting in the War of 1812, are seen as kind of these dupe figures that don't really have any agency. That was true of the black soldiers fighting for the British. That was true of sort of the black intellectuals of the 20th century who praised the gains of the Soviet Union.
Well, of course, the propagandists of U.S. imperialism will seek to cast aspersions on and besmirch the reputations of black people who don't go along with their program. I mean, what else do you expect? I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, between 1941 and 1945, as you probably know, the United States was allied with Moscow. And so the line, basically, in the United States nowadays is that if you were a dupe, if you were aligned with Moscow before 1941, and after 1945, but you're a hero if you were aligned with Moscow between 1941 and 1945. I mean, that barely passes the giggle test, quite frankly. I mean, black people, like any other oppressed people, oftentimes have to make judgments and alliances that are not necessarily congruent with and consistent with the judgments and alliances of their oppressors. I think that we should expect no less, and I think that part of the, quote, success, unquote, of U.S. imperialism and settler colonialism in North America has been its ability to convince those it's oppressing that they should somehow go along with this oppression, that their oppressors are actually their friends, and those that want to help them are actually their enemies and antagonists. The essence of the black radical tradition is to be able to see through the nonsense and be able to determine who our friends are and who our antagonists are and act upon same.
And are we seeing some of that today?
Well, it's very curious. I think it was January 5th, 2018, at the debate on the United Nations Security Council about the protests that were then unfolding in Iran. The Russian delegate, the Security Council meeting said, well, why are we discussing protests in Iran? I don't recall us discussing Black Lives Matter or protests in Ferguson, Missouri, or protests after the police killings in Minnesota and Texas, and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And that was a fair point. And I know that there's some of our fellow residents of North America who cannot understand the election of Donald J. Trump, who in many ways is not an anomaly or an aberration. He's totally consistent with the warp and woof of U.S. history, whether these residents want to realize that or not. But they think that if they can show that he was somehow tied to Moscow, then that will lead to an impeachment. Well, one, I think that certainly the special counsel Robert Mueller needs to investigate money laundering with Deutsche Bank of Germany, and I understand that he has subpoenaed records in order to do so. Secondly, however, I think the question that all of us need to answer is if Moscow interfered in the elections of 2016 through Facebook ads and all the rest, because we've been told that they didn't tamper with the ballot box, well, then why did Black people who I take it are on the internet and have Facebook accounts and Twitter accounts, why did they vote for him 9-1? And why did this so-called interference affect so many defined as white? I mean, that's the fundamental question that oftentimes is ignored, which is not surprising in this country. I mean, you have people in the United States who debate politics all the time, and they don't know that in Dixie, for the last 60 years, since the last 50 years since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that the Euro-American population has voted for the GOP 9-1. Many of them don't know that Black people usually vote against the GOP 9-1. And, these are just basic ABC facts, and yet you have people pontificating in the mass media all the time without having an understanding of these elementary figures. But once again, to get to the essence of your question, I think that part and parcel of the Black radical tradition is to be able, once again, not only to do an analysis, but also to have your figures straight when you do an analysis, and also to realize and recognize the weaknesses and debilities of some of our liberal friends. And you mentioned that interview I did on Radio Sputnik. One of the points that I made there that I think has struck a chord was my analysis of the historical roots of what might be called white liberalism. What I pointed out in that interview, and I'll repeat here, is that there were basically three factions in the antebellum pre-Civil War history of the United States of America. There's the John Brown faction, John Brown being the Euro-American man who tried to lead an armed revolt against slavery, the greatest, quote, white, unquote, hero in the Black American tradition. W.B. Du Bois wrote a book about him. But John Brown, who was hung until he was executed in 1859, was part of a minority tradition, even though the historians might lead you to believe he was part of the majority. Then there's the pro-slavery faction, as evidenced by the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, all the rest, John Adams, who was a lawyer for slave owners, John Hancock, whose name was on the founding document, who was one of the biggest slave owners in New England. And then there's the so-called anti-slavery faction. But if you drill down, you'll find that when slavery was abolished in the 1770s in Vermont, it was an attempt really to get rid of the Negroes. Just as when Oregon came into the Union in the 1850s, no Negroes were supposed to be able to set foot in Oregon. There's been this strong and resonant white man's country tradition, which, of course, Abraham Lincoln subscribed to, almost up until the time when he was assassinated. You may know, as I said in my book on Brazil, he tried to ship the freed Negroes to Brazil, but the Brazilians wouldn't take us. And then after Lincoln was assassinated and slavery was abolished, the white man's country tradition continued with the attempt to establish Jim Crow, all white spaces. And that attempt to create all-white spaces is still with us. Just look at the neighborhoods. You're in Austin, Texas, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, look at Austin, Texas, for example. I mean, isn't it an accident that you have these all-white neighborhoods in Austin, Texas that coincidentally enough coincide with class as well? And it's not only that, but I use the example of, in terms of whiteness and liberalism, WNYC radios in New York, a liberal institution, NPR, they established this program, The Takeaway, and the Euro-American host, whenever they paired him with a black woman, he would run them out of the studio. He told one that she was a, quote, diversity hire and told her to go lose weight. And he harassed the others. Finally, after the Harvey Weinstein Me Too campaign of the fall of 2017, he lost his job. But that was just one more aspect of how the liberals and white supremacy and whiteness are difficult to disentangle, which is one of the reasons why they can talk about the election of Trump without even mentioning that about 90+% of Trump's voters came from the Euro-American community, and can talk about Moscow interfering in elections and not talk about how this alleged interference apparently didn't affect the black voters. And unfortunately, I'm on this ship of fools with these liberals and conservatives at the helm. And so I realize we're headed for an iceberg. The only thing that I find sobering that I'm on this ship of fools with them.
You know, as far as racially conscious candidates, Hillary Clinton was about as bad as the Democratic Party could have done. Speaking of the tradition of white liberalism or whatnot, when you consider so many people are outraged at Trump's comments on Haiti right now, for instance, but it was not concerned one bit about the actual U.S. interference in the Caribbean. You've written several books on what the U.S. has actually done to the Caribbean. Can you maybe talk about the racism in U.S. policies toward Caribbean, either historically or up through the moment of the Clinton Foundation and whatnot?
Well, mentioning the Clinton Foundation raises the question of Haiti. And raising the question of Haiti raises the question of the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804. One of the most important historical events to ever to take place in this hemisphere, an event that involved a successful revolt of the enslaved against the slave owners, igniting a general crisis of the entire slave system, leading to that system's collapse, not least in this hemisphere. And it's no accident that Donald J. Trump, in terms of countries that he singles out for condemnation and vituperation, singles out Haiti because, as you know, there's still anger that may be consciously buried in the recesses, the dark recesses of the brain of people like Donald J. Trump, assuming that he has a brain, of course. But there is still antagonism towards Haiti because it jeopardized the fortunes of slave owners when it abolished slavery. There was a U.S. occupation of Haiti for about 20 years, from the beginning of the World War I era until the mid-1930s. After the Haitian earthquake circa 2010, one of the most disastrous natural disasters in human history, thousands, tens of thousands killed, you had these so-called charities coming to Haiti to suck the lifeblood further out of that country. That is to say that many people donated charitably to Haiti and found that their money was then being embezzled by disreputable figures, some of which were tied to the Clinton Foundation. And of course, Hillary Rodham Clinton happened to be Secretary of State at the time of the earthquake, and her husband, Bill, was the kind of viceroy in Haiti, creating favorable conditions for the kind of exploitation that I've just referenced. And then that led to thousands of Haitians coming to the United States and getting temporary protected status, which Mr. Trump says he's going to revoke this year. Already, there are thousands of Haitians languishing in Baja California, that is to say in Mexico, across the border from San Diego. I think if there are progressive voices and forces in your audience, which I'm sure there are, they owe it to themselves. And they certainly owe it to Haiti, which has sacrificed so much for the rest of us, to raise their voices and organize on behalf of these Haitian migrants who or find themselves either trapped in Mexico or about to be ousted from the United States of America. In some of the speeches of Frederick Douglass, too, although if you look at his July 4th, 1852 speech, which you can find James Earl Jones, the actor, or Danny Glover, the actor, reading on YouTube, you'll see much more skepticism about the beneficence of the United States of America. But I think it has to do with the way history is written. I don't think the historians have done a good job of explaining the history of the United States of America. Keep in mind that until recently, in historical terms, Black people such as myself were basically barred from archives. And so it was difficult to access the records in order to tell a true story of the United States of America. And I don't think that I'm, pardon the expression, blowing my own horn to suggest that some of the work that I've done, particularly my book on 1776, or my latest book on the apocalypse of settler colonialism, the roots of slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism in 17th century North America and the Caribbean, that it's only in recent historical terms that you've begun to get actual critiques of the founding of the United States of America. I mean, look at the book by the Native American historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who you probably should interview, The Indigenous People's History in the United States. And it's very curious that it's the indigenous scholars and the African scholars, such as myself, who are trying to revise the creation myth of the United States. It does not speak well, quite frankly, for our melanin-deficient brothers and sisters who have had access to the archives since the founding of this country to have not turned out this work. That does not speak well, I must say. There is this unscientific approach to U.S. politics where either A, you see Trump as an anomaly or as an aberration outside of the so-called fine traditions of the United States of America, or B, such as when he issues racist statements about Haiti and Africa, you say that that's not who we are and try to detach him from the 63 million people who voted for him, not to mention the long decades of U.S. history. And so it becomes an individual flaw. And therefore, you don't have to analyze the culture and the society from which this individual emerged. You can say, oh, if we can just get rid of Trump, everything will be, pardon the expression, hunky-dory. But I'm afraid to say that that's mythology. That's the looniest idea since Looney Tunes. As a matter of fact, anybody who believes that, I'd like to partake of some of what you're smoking, albeit in California, Colorado, just to be clear. But this is part of the problem. And I think many would be well advised to study the Black radical tradition because, as noted, in the Black radical tradition, what you try to do is an analysis that soars far beyond the subjectivity of the individual and somehow get to an objective analysis of the forces and factors involved.
That was an interview that I recorded in early 2018 with Dr. Gerald Horne, who's a professor at the University of Houston, as well as the author of many books, including The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism and The Counter-Revolution of 1776, the latter of which is one of my favorite books of all time. I later interviewed him about that book, and it's definitely kind of worth a read to sort of, to chip away at sort of the mythology of American settler colonialism. Anyway, that was specifically talking about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, especially his situation within the Black radical tradition. I hope that was informative. And so, yeah, thank you for listening. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.